house on Greystone Lane. It was the summer of 2005, and I was taking a short leave from my duties in the United States Navy. After months at sea, I looked forward to spending time with my family in Michigan before heading to Florida for a quick visit. But the highlight of my break was a planned visit to my fiancée, Alex, who lived in a small, rural town in upstate New York. Alex and I had been engaged for 6 months, and though his work as an engineer often kept him busy, we were excited to finally spend time together in his childhood home. My father and stepmother offered to drive me to Alex's house, and I gladly accepted. It wasn't a long trip, and the thought of seeing Alex after such a long time apart filled me with excitement. But as we turned onto Greystone Lane, my anticipation was overshadowed by an unexplainable sense of unease. Alex's house stood at the end of a long, narrow driveway overgrown with weeds. The structure itself was old and decaying, with peeling paint and broken shutters barely hanging onto the windows. Dead trees surrounded the property, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky like bony fingers. My father, sensing my hesitation, laughed it off. "It's just an old house, Clara. Don't let it get to you." But it did get to me. Something about the place felt wrong, almost as if the house itself was alive and watching me. I didn't mention my feelings to my father or stepmother. I chalked it up to nerves and assured myself that everything would be fine. As soon as we stepped inside, the oppressive atmosphere worsened. The interior was dimly lit, the walls stained with watermarks and faint streaks of mold. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that made me queasy. My father and stepmother stayed long enough to ensure Alex would arrive shortly before leaving me alone in the house. I spent the next hour wandering through the dark, creaky rooms, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to stretch and shift in the dim light. Every so often, I thought I heard faint whispers just beyond the edge of my hearing. By the time Alex finally arrived, I was nearly ready to flee. "Sorry I'm late," he said as he stepped through the door. "Work ran long." I didn't tell him about my unease. Instead, I forced a smile and greeted him with a hug, grateful for his presence. That night, I struggled to sleep. The old bed in the guest room creaked with every movement, and the faint scratching noises coming from the walls kept me on edge. I tried to dismiss it as mice or the wind, but the darkness felt alive, pressing down on me. The following evening, I was even more restless. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a sudden sensation washed over me. It felt like someone was leaning over me, their face mere inches from mine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare open my eyes, too terrified of what I might see. I remained like that for what felt like hours until exhaustion finally dragged me into a restless sleep. The next morning, as I sat up in bed, I noticed something strange. My hair felt tangled and heavy in places. Reaching up, my fingers brushed against something foreign. I pulled it free and stared in horror. A small, glittery pink hair clip. It was the kind of clip you'd find in a child's hair, completely out of place in this old, desolate house. Alex had no siblings, and there were no children around. I showed it to him, my voice trembling. "Did you do this?" I asked, half hoping he'd admit to playing some kind of twisted joke. Alex frowned and shook his head. "I don't know where that came from. Maybe you brought it with you." I knew I hadn't. The very sight of it made my stomach churn. The next few days were filled with more strange occurrences. Doors slammed on their own. Cold drafts swept through rooms without explanation, and faint laughter echoed in the hallways at night. Desperate for answers, I decided to dig into the house's history. Using Alex's computer, I searched local archives and old newspaper records. What I found chilled me to the core. The house had once belonged to a man named Thomas Gray, a reclusive widower with a young daughter named Emily. In 1967, Emily vanished under mysterious circumstances. Her disappearance was never solved, and Thomas fell into despair, eventually taking his own life. Rumors spread that the house was cursed, that Emily's spirit lingered, searching for someone to play with. The details matched the eerie experiences I'd been having: the childlike hair clip, the laughter, the sensation of being watched. On my last night in the house, I woke to the sound of faint giggling. Sitting up in bed, I saw the silhouette of a small girl standing in the corner of the room. Her figure was barely illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move but seemed to grow darker, its outline shifting and pulsating. Suddenly, the room grew unbearably cold, and the girl's laughter turned into a guttural scream. The walls seemed to close in, and the air became thick, making it hard to breathe. I bolted out of bed and ran into the hallway, where Alex stood, pale and trembling. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Before I could answer, the lights flickered and went out. In the darkness, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the house, growing louder and closer. Grabbing Alex's hand, I pulled him toward the front door. We didn't stop running until we were safely in my car. I never returned to that house on Greystone Lane. Alex and I broke off our engagement shortly after, the strain of that experience driving a wedge between us. Years later, I still think about that house and the malevolent presence within. Was it Emily's spirit, angry and restless? Or was it something darker, feeding off the fear of those who dared to enter? Whatever the answer, I know one thing for certain: some places are better left undisturbed. The haunting at Evergreen Boutique. For nearly 5 years, I worked at a boutique on Evergreen Avenue in the heart of Chicago. It was a busy street, vibrant with life, directly across from the famous Harmony Fountain, a landmark that drew tourists and locals alike. The boutique catered to a diverse clientele and was known for its elegant displays and impeccable service. Yet, behind the glossy facade, there was an undercurrent of unease, one that I felt more keenly with each passing day. It all began during my second month on the job. As I adjusted to the long hours and late-night shifts, I started noticing something or someone unusual. Every so often, out of the corner of my eye, I would catch a glimpse of a tall woman with blonde hair, about 5 feet 5 inches, dressed in what looked like vintage clothing. She would appear in the reflection of the mirrors or on the edge of my peripheral vision. But the moment I turned to face her, she was gone. I initially dismissed it as a trick of the light or my imagination, but the occurrences became more frequent. Sometimes, I could swear I heard faint footsteps behind me, only to turn and find no one there. When I mentioned it to my colleagues, they laughed it off, teasing me about my overactive imagination. I quickly earned a reputation as the odd one, the ghost guy. The boutique was vast, with sprawling backrooms divided into 4 sections: the main stockroom, the accessories area, the clothing racks, and what everyone called the shoe room. The shoe room was infamous among the staff for its oppressive atmosphere. Many refused to work there alone, citing an inexplicable chill or the feeling of being watched. Unlike my coworkers, I wasn't easily spooked. In fact, I preferred the late-night shifts when the store was quiet, and I could work without interruptions. One particular night, I was tasked with restocking shelves in the shoe room. It was around 2:30 a.m., and I was alone except for my manager, Clara, who was in the main office reviewing inventory reports. As I sorted through boxes, I heard it, a soft voice calling my name. Daniel! I froze. It wasn't Clara. The voice was higher-pitched and faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. Clara? I called out, my voice breaking the silence. I walked out of the shoe room and found Clara sitting at her desk, her brow furrowed in concentration. Did you call me just now? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She looked up, confused. No. Why? Before I could answer, the lights in the storeroom flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Clara and I exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. We finished our tasks quickly that night and left together, neither of us willing to linger any longer than necessary. The woman in the mirror. Over time, I learned that I wasn't the only one who had seen the blonde woman. One of my colleagues, Mark, confessed during a late shift that he'd also caught glimpses of her. He described her in the exact same way, tall, blonde, and always disappearing before he could get a clear look. She's always near the mirrors, he said. It's like she's drawn to them. From that night on, I paid closer attention. Sure enough, her appearances seemed centered around the boutique's large mirrors. Once, while cleaning the floor near the entrance, I caught a clear reflection of her standing at the far end of the store. Her head was slightly tilted, as if she were observing me. This time, I didn't look away. I walked toward her, determined to confront whatever or whoever she was. But as I reached the spot, there was nothing there, only the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. As the years went on, the boutique began to struggle financially. Foot traffic dwindled, and management decided to downsize, eventually announcing plans to relocate to a smaller space across town. While most of my co-workers were disheartened by the news, I felt an odd sense of relief. The strange occurrences had grown more frequent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself held some dark, lingering energy. On one of our final nights in the store, Clara and I worked late packing up inventory. The shoe room was nearly empty, save for a few scattered boxes. As I carried the last box out, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the shelves. "Clara!" I shouted, dropping the box and rushing to the door. She appeared moments later, wide-eyed. "What happened?" "The door. It just slammed," I stammered. She frowned. "There's no draft in here." Before we could investigate further, the sound of footsteps echoed through the storeroom. They were heavy and deliberate, moving toward us. Clara grabbed my arm, her face pale. "Let's go," she whispered. We didn't stop until we were outside, the cool night air a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere we just left behind. The boutique closed its doors for good a week later. The new location was modern and bright, free of the eerie shadows and oppressive silence that had haunted the old store. Yet, even in the new space, I found myself glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see a familiar blonde figure staring back at me. I never did. To this day, I wonder about that woman and the strange energy that lingered in the old building. Was she a restless spirit tied to the mirrors? Or was she a manifestation of something deeper, something connected to the history of the place? I'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain. Some places leave an indelible mark, their stories lingering long after the doors have closed. The dormitory spirit. I arrived at Ridgewood University in the fall of 2010, excited for a fresh start. The sprawling campus in the heart of Vermont was breathtaking, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. My dormitory, Maple Hall, was one of the oldest buildings on campus, with its red brick facade and ivy-covered walls. I'd heard stories about its history, how it had once been a boarding school before being converted into a dormitory in the early 1900s. But I didn't pay much attention. To me, it was simply a place to live while I pursued my degree. My roommate, Lila, was friendly and outgoing. We got along well, and soon I started to feel at home. Maple Hall had a warm, rustic charm with its creaky wooden floors and large bay windows. But beneath the surface, there was something about the building that made me uneasy. One night, about a month into the semester, I was alone in my room studying. Lila had gone to the library, and the dorm was unusually quiet. The only sound was the occasional gust of wind rattling the old windows. As I sat at my desk, I felt a sudden chill. Glancing toward the door, I noticed something strange. A faint silhouette reflected in the glass of the window. It was a woman, her figure hazy but unmistakable. She appeared to be standing just outside my door, her head tilted as if she were listening. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or my tired mind playing tricks on me. Moments later, Lila returned, her arms full of books. Seeing my pale face, she asked if I was okay. I hesitated, then told her what I had seen. She laughed nervously and shrugged it off, but I could tell she was unsettled. That night, couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind set me on edge. The next day, I decided to talk to another friend, Kara, who lived down the hall. Kara was known for her curiosity and love of campus lore. If anyone could explain what I had seen, it was her. As I described the woman's silhouette, Kara's face grew pale. She sat down slowly, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. "I've seen her too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A couple of weeks ago, late at night, I thought I was imagining things." Kara hesitated, then added, "I've actually done some research about Maple Hall. Did you know there's a history of incidents here? A student took her own life in my room years ago." The words sent a shiver down my spine. "Are you serious?" She nodded. It was back in the 1980s. Her name was Eleanor. She was a freshman, struggling with homesickness and the pressure of school. One night, her roommate found her in the closet. Her voice trailed off, and she looked away. I didn't know what to say. The idea that the woman I'd seen could be the spirit of a student who had died decades ago was too much to process. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences intensified. Objects would move on their own. My textbooks would be out of place. And once, my lamp turned on by itself in the middle of the night. Lila started noticing things too. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, we both heard it, a faint humming, like someone softly singing a lullaby, came from the closet. Lila froze, her toothbrush still in her hand. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, too scared to speak. Summoning all my courage, I opened the closet door. There was nothing inside but our clothes and a pile of shoes. The humming stopped instantly. We spent that night huddled together in Lila's bed, too afraid to sleep, desperate for answers. Kara and I decided to dig deeper into Eleanor's story. We visited the university archives, where we found an old newspaper clipping about her death. The article confirmed everything Kara had told me. Eleanor had been a talented artist with a bright future, but she struggled to adapt to college life. Her death shocked the campus, and Maple Hall was briefly closed for renovations afterward. One detail in the article caught my attention. Eleanor had loved to sing. Her friends described her voice as hauntingly beautiful, often heard late at night when she thought no one was listening. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt a sudden warmth wash over me. It was a stark contrast to the usual chill that accompanied the strange events. Sitting up, I saw her, the woman from the silhouette. She stood at the foot of my bed, her figure clearer than ever. She was young, with long dark hair and sad eyes. She wore a simple white dress, and her expression was one of longing. For a moment, I was too stunned to move. Then, as if sensing my fear, she smiled faintly and raised a hand as if to wave. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say anything, she vanished. After that night, the strange occurrences stopped. It was as if Eleanor had finally found peace. Lila and I stayed in Maple Hall for the rest of the semester without incident. To this day, I still think about her. I hope that, wherever she is, she's at peace. But every now and then, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I can still hear her humming. The house on Elmwood Street. In the spring of 2012, I moved into a red brick house on Elmwood Street in the small town of Westfield, Massachusetts. It was a fresh start after my divorce, a chance to rebuild my life in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by towering oaks and maple trees. The house had charm, classic colonial architecture, wide windows, and a spacious interior. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like the right place to begin again. Most of the furniture was mine, carefully chosen from my old home. Among the pieces I brought was a heavy, wrought iron wall hanging with 3 small mirrors embedded within its intricate design. This piece had always been a conversation starter in my previous home, and I decided to place it above the counter in the kitchen, a central area that connected to the family room, sunroom, and pantry. The mirrors added a touch of elegance to the space, and I thought nothing of it as I settled in. But that first night, something changed. It was late when I finally finished unpacking the essentials. Exhausted, I sat at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea, staring at the mirrors. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, the kind of sounds you'd expect in an older home. Yet, there was something unnerving about the way the mirrors seemed to reflect more than just the room. They captured angles that felt unnatural, showing glimpses of spaces I hadn't noticed before. I tried to brush off the feeling as first-night jitters, but as I turned to head to bed, I found myself stopping mid-step. The reflection in one of the mirrors wasn't just showing the room. It showed a shadow, faint but distinctly human-shaped, moving across the sunroom. My heart raced, but when I turned around, the sunroom was empty. Without a second thought, I grabbed the wrought iron piece off the wall and placed it on the floor, leaning it against the counter. Whatever unease I felt, I didn't want it hanging there anymore. The following morning, I decided to make peace with my paranoia. It was an old house, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I told myself. I sat at the counter, sipping coffee, and glanced at the mirrors now propped up against the wall. Suddenly, one of the mirrors tilted forward. It was as if an invisible hand had pushed it, making the heavy iron piece hover in midair for a split second before it slammed back against the wall with a deafening crash. I jumped out of my seat, staring at the piece in disbelief. The nail it had been hung on was intact, the wall undisturbed. There was no earthquake, no draft, nothing that could have caused it to move. Over the next few weeks, strange incidents began to happen with increasing frequency. It started with small things, doors creaking open on their own, faint knocking sounds in the middle of the night, and lights flickering in the bathroom. One day, as I walked through the doorway to the pantry, the door frame behind me cracked loudly. When I turned, I saw that a chunk of wood had splintered off as if something had slammed into it the moment I passed through. Another evening, I heard the distinct sound of the closet door handle in the hallway rattling. When I went to check, The handle was still moving, as if someone were trying to open it from the inside. But when I opened the door, nothing was there. One of the most unsettling moments happened late one night as I sat in the living room with my dog, Max, asleep at my feet. I heard 3 sharp knocks on the glass of the back door. Startled, I got up to check, but the backyard was empty. Max, who rarely reacted to anything, remained sound asleep, oblivious to the noise. That same night, the lights in the bathroom suddenly flickered and went out, leaving the room in complete darkness. By this point, I was losing sleep and growing increasingly anxious in my own home. Hoping to find some explanation, I started researching the property's history. I learned that the house had been built in the 1920s by a family who lived there for several decades. The last recorded owner before me had been an elderly woman who passed away in the house. There were no reports of anything unusual, no tragic deaths, no scandals, but something about the energy in the house felt unresolved. The disturbances continued sporadically, but they never escalated beyond unnerving. I learned to live with the strange occurrences, treating them as part of the house's quirks. In the spring of 2013, I sold the house to a retired schoolteacher named Margaret. She seemed enchanted by the property and wasn't fazed when I mentioned its peculiarities. A year later, I ran into Margaret at the local farmer's market. She looked tired, her usually cheerful demeanor subdued. "I've been meaning to ask," she said hesitantly. "Did you ever notice anything unusual in the house?" When I admitted that I had, she nodded grimly. "A few months ago, I was sitting in the sunroom when a small wooden cross I'd placed on the mantel flew across the room. It nearly hit me," she said. "I don't know what's going on in that house, but it doesn't feel settled. To this day, I think about the house on Elmwood Street. I wonder if Margaret still lives there, if she's learned to coexist with whatever lingers within its walls. For me, that house will always remain a mystery, whether it was the mirrors, the house itself, or something else entirely. I'll never know. But one thing is certain. Some places hold onto their history in ways we may never fully understand." Thank you for spending your time with us tonight, exploring these mysterious and spine-chilling stories. If these tales have sparked your curiosity or left you with unforgettable feelings, don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've had similar paranormal experiences that you'd like to share, feel free to send your story to the email address provided in the description. Who knows? Your story might become part of our journey into the spiritual world in a future episode. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our haunting tales. See you in the next episode, and remember, always keep a light by your side.